We took one F-150, split the year in half, and ran 5W-20 for 6 months, then switched to 5W-30 in the exact same truck for the next 6 months, tracking everything from oil pressure to fuel economy to wear metals the entire time. By the end of the year, one of these viscosities had a clear advantage, and it wasn't the one Ford recommends from the factory. I'll show you exactly what we measured and why it matters for your truck. Before we get into the results, let's talk about why this test actually matters, because a lot of people think oil viscosity is just a number on a bottle that doesn't make much real difference. It makes a massive difference, and the confusion around it costs people money and, in some cases, engine life. Viscosity is a measurement of how thick or thin an oil is and how much it resists flowing. The two numbers on the bottle, like 5W-20 or 5W-30, describe the oil's behavior at two different temperatures. The number before the W describes how the oil flows in cold conditions, tested at low temperature to simulate winter starts, and the W actually stands for winter, not weight. The number after the W describes how the oil behaves at full operating temperature around 212 degrees Fahrenheit. A 5W-20 and a 5W-30 behave almost identically when cold, since they share the same 5W's cold flow rating. But once the engine reaches operating temperature, the 30 weight oil maintains a noticeably thicker film than the 20 weight. For this test, we used one 2018 F-150 with the 5.0-liter Coyote Phi-8, a truck we had already tracked for 2 years prior, with consistent maintenance records and a clean bill of health from a pre-test inspection, including a compression test and a bore scope look at the cylinders to confirm there was no pre-existing carbon buildup or wear that could skew results. Ford's factory recommendation for this engine is 5W-20 full synthetic, so for the first 6 months, we simply followed the factory spec exactly, changing the oil every 7,500 miles per the manufacturer's suggested interval, and using a full synthetic 5W-20 from a major brand each time. We drove the truck through a normal mix of daily driving, about 55% highway and 45% city and stop-and-go traffic. No towing during this phase to keep the baseline clean. We logged oil pressure readings at idle and at highway cruising speed every single week using a scan tool plugged into the OBD2 port, since oil pressure is one of the clearest real-time indicators of how well the oil is maintaining film strength inside the engine. During the first 6 months on 5W-20, average idle oil pressure at normal operating temperature sat around 18 to 20 pounds per square inch, which is right in line with what Ford considers healthy for this engine at idle when hot. At highway speed, pressure climbed to a consistent 48 to 52 pounds per square inch. Fuel economy averaged 19.4 miles per gallon combined over those 6 months based on fill-up calculations rather than the dash computer, which tends to run slightly optimistic. Cold start behavior was excellent, which makes sense given that thinner oil flows faster to critical components, like the camshaft and lifters within the first few seconds of startup, when the vast majority of engine wear actually occurs because oil has not fully circulated yet. We pulled an oil sample at the 5,000-mile mark within this phase and sent it to a lab for analysis. Wear metals came back low across the board, iron around 9 parts per million, copper around 4 parts per million, both well within the normal range for a healthy engine at that mileage. At the 6-month mark, with the truck sitting right around 11,000 miles for that half of the test, we switched to 5W-30 full synthetic, same brand, same filter, same 7,500 mile change interval, and kept every other variable identical. Same driver rotation, same routes, same fuel stations, same mix of highway and city driving. This is the only way a test like this means anything. Because if you change more than one variable at a time, you can't isolate what caused the difference in results. Almost immediately, we noticed a small shift in oil pressure readings. Idle pressure at operating temperature climbed slightly to 21 to 23 pounds per square inch, and highway pressure settled around 53 to 56 pounds per square inch. That's not a dramatic jump, but it's a consistent and measurable increase, and it lines up exactly with what you would expect from a thicker oil that resists flow slightly more and maintains a thicker film between moving parts under load. Fuel economy dropped slightly during this phase, averaging 19.0 miles per gallon combined compared to 19.4 on the thinner oil, a difference of about 2% that's consistent with the small amount of additional internal friction a thicker oil creates as the engine works marginally harder to pump it through the system. If you're finding this comparison useful, go ahead and hit that like button, because the wear metal data is where this test really gets interesting, and it's not what most people expect. We pulled oil samples at the same relative mileage point in the 5W-30 phase, roughly 5,000 miles into that half of the test, and sent them to the same lab using the same testing methodology for a fair comparison. Iron came back at 7 parts per million, slightly lower than the 9 we saw in 5W-20. Copper came back at 3 parts per million, also slightly lower than the 4 we measured before. These are small differences, and on their own, neither number is a red flag either way. Both oils are protecting this engine well within normal parameters. But the fact that the thicker oil trended towards slightly lower wear metal readings tells us something important about how film strength works under real driving conditions, especially during the summer months this phase overlapped with, when ambient and underhood temperatures run higher and thinner oils are more prone to losing viscosity from heat. We also tracked oil consumption between changes for both phases, since consumption is one of the more practical, real-world signs of how well an oil is sealing against the piston rings and holding up under combustion pressure and heat. On 5W-20, the truck consumed close to 3/4 of a quart between the 7,500 mile changes, which is within a normal range for this engine, but on the higher side of normal. On 5W-30, consumption dropped to roughly 1/3 of a quart over the same interval length, a noticeable improvement. Thicker oil forms a slightly more robust seal against the piston rings and cylinder walls, which reduces the amount that gets past the rings and burns off during combustion, something engineers call blow-by. This matched what we expected going in, since it's a well-documented characteristic of viscosity differences, but it was still satisfying to see it show up clearly in a real-world test rather than just in a lab spec sheet. Cold start behavior during the 5W-30 phase was where we noticed the only real drawback. On mornings when the temperature dropped into the 30s, there was a very slight, almost imperceptible increase in the time it took for oil pressure to build after startup, measured in fractions of a second using the scan tool's live data stream. This lines up with the basic physics of viscosity. A 30-weight oil, even one rated 5W for cold flow, is still marginally thicker than a 20-weight oil once you are talking about the actual moment of ignition and that first half second before oil pressure fully establishes itself. In a climate that regularly sees hard freezes or extreme cold, this difference could matter more. In the climate where we ran this test, with winter lows rarely dropping below the mid-20s, the difference was measurable on the scan tool, but not something you would ever notice from the driver's seat. We also wanted to check how each oil performed under a load, since most owners who are debating between 5W-20 and 5W-30 are often doing so because they TOW or haul with their F-150, at least occasionally. During the final month of the 5W-30 phase, we hooked up a 6,500-pound trailer and ran a series of identical towing routes that included sustained highway speed, some grade climbing, and stop-and-go traffic pulling out of rest stops, logging oil temperature throughout using a supplemental oil temperature gauge tapped into the pan. Oil temperature under this towing load peaked at 238 degrees Fahrenheit on the 5W-30, We do not have a direct towing comparison on the 5W-20 phase since we intentionally avoided towing during that half to keep the baseline clean, but based on published viscosity index data for both oils and how they behave as temperature climbs, a 20-weight oil under that same sustained load and heat would be operating closer to the thin end of its protective range, while the 30-weight oil still had meaningful film thickness in reserve even at that elevated temperature. This is exactly why Ford's own severe duty and towing guidance for several of their EcoBoost and Coyote-equipped trucks specifically calls for the heavier oil when you are regularly working the truck hard, even on engines where 20 weight is the standard recommendation for normal use. Before we get to the final numbers, if you are the kind of person who tows regularly or just wants to see more of these real-world side-by-side engine tests, subscribe and hit the bell, because we have got a full year of towing-specific oil testing coming up next using 2 more identical trucks. Let's talk about the bigger picture and what a full year of data across both phases actually tells us. Fuel economy favored 5W-20, coming in about 2% better across the 6 months we tested it, which over a full year of average driving might save you somewhere in the range of $15 to $25 in fuel, depending on your local gas prices and annual mileage. That's a real but modest advantage, and it's the main reason manufacturers push thinner oils across so many modern engines, since even small efficiency gains matter enormously when you're talking about an entire fleet of vehicles being tested for corporate average fuel economy compliance. Cold start protection also slightly favored 5W-20, though the difference was small enough that it likely only matters in genuinely cold climates with regular sub-freezing starts. Oil consumption, wear metal readings, and towing performance all favored 5W-30, and these are the categories that matter most if your priority is long-term engine durability rather than squeezing out the last percentage point of fuel economy. So which one actually wins for a typical F-150 owner? If your truck rarely tows, you live somewhere with cold winters, and fuel economy is a real priority for you, sticking with the factory-recommended 5W-20s makes complete sense, and the data doesn't show any alarming downside to using it as intended. But if you tow occasionally, live somewhere with hot summers, or you just want the added margin of protection that a slightly thicker film provides under real-world stress, our year of data points toward 5W-30 as the more durable choice, with only a small trade-off in fuel economy and a barely measurable difference in cold start speed. It's worth noting that using 5W-30 instead of the factory-specified 5W-20 on most of these engines doesn't void your warranty or violate manufacturer specifications, since Ford itself lists 5W-30 as an acceptable alternative for several Coyote and EcoBoost applications, particularly for trucks used in towing, hauling, or hot climate conditions, even though 5W-20 remains the primary recommendation on the label under the hood. What this test really shows is that the difference between these two viscosities is not dramatic in either direction over the course of a year and around 22,000 combined miles, but the trends are consistent and they line up exactly with the underlying oil chemistry and physics you would expect. Thinner oil flows faster when cold and creates slightly less internal friction, which shows up as better fuel economy and marginally quicker oil pressure buildup at startup. Thicker oil maintains a more robust film under heat and load, which shows up as lower wear metals, less consumption, and better protection when you are towing or working the truck hard. Neither oil failed this engine in any meaningful way over the course of the year, and that is an important takeaway on its own. Both viscosities, when using a quality full synthetic and following proper change intervals, kept this Coyote Vive 8 running clean and healthy. The real decision comes down to how you actually use your truck and matching the oil to your specific driving conditions, rather than blindly following either the factory sticker or whatever your buddy at the parts counter tells you. We are going to keep this truck in rotation for future testing, and next up, we are planning a direct comparison of full synthetic versus synthetic blend at the same 5W-30 viscosity, So if you want to see how much of a difference the base oil quality itself makes, once you have settled on the right weight, make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss it. If you found this test helpful, drop a comment telling me which viscosity your F-150 runs and whether you have ever noticed a difference switching between them, and share this with anyone still arguing about which oil weight is actually better for their truck. I will see you in the next one.